The warehouse fell silent except for the rhythmic drip of water from a broken pipe somewhere in the darkness above. Daisy Perry pressed herself against the cold concrete wall, her camouflage uniform still damp with sweat from the midnight training. Exercise that had ended 20 minutes ago. She shouldn't be here. None of the other recruits had been summoned to this abandoned supply depot on the edge of Fort Braxton after lights out. But General Marcus Thorne had made his intentions crystal clear in his whispered command during evening formation. "Meet me in Warehouse 7, alone. That's an order. Private Perry." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Her fingers traced the combat knife secured to her belt, a habit she developed during 3 tours of duty before transferring to this elite special operations training program. The blade had saved her life in Afghanistan, in Syria, and in places that didn't officially exist on any military maps. Now, standing in this musty warehouse with its towers of forgotten equipment, casting twisted shadows in the moonlight, streaming through broken skylights, she wondered if she might need it again, not against enemy combatants, but against the man who was supposed to be training her to become one of the military's most elite operatives. General Thorne's footsteps echoed from the far end of the warehouse, each bootfall deliberate and predatory. At 52, he commanded respect through fear rather than admiration, his silver-streaked hair and granite jaw making him appear distinguished to visiting politicians and defense contractors. But Daisy had seen the way his pale gray eyes lingered on the female recruits during physical training, had noticed how his tactical assessments always seemed to require private meetings with women in isolated locations. She'd heard the whispered rumors and the mess hall stories that were quickly silenced when Thorne's loyal sergeants appeared. Stories about careers destroyed and women mysteriously reassigned to dead-end positions after refusing the general's special attention. Private Perry, his voice cut through the darkness like a blade, cultured and smooth, despite the underlying menace. Punctual, I appreciate that quality in my soldiers. She stepped away from the wall, keeping her hands loose at her sides, ready. "Sir, you requested my presence for additional tactical assessment." The general's laugh was low and humorless as he emerged from behind a stack of crated supplies, his dress uniform pristine, despite the industrial grime coating everything else in the warehouse. "Is that what we're calling it? Tactical assessment?" His eyes gleamed in the moonlight as he began to circle her, predator studying prey. "You're different from the others, Perry. 3 combat tours, distinguished service record, commendations for valor under fire. Most women who apply for special ops are trying to prove something. But you've already proven everything." Daisy remained motionless, tracking his movement with peripheral vision while keeping her gaze fixed straight ahead. "I'm here to serve, sir, nothing more." "Nothing more," he repeated, stopping directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne he wore and the whiskey on his breath. "That's where you're wrong, Private. There's always more. There's always the question of how far someone is willing to go for their career, for their country, for their future." His hand moved toward her face, fingers extended as if to caress. Her cheek and every muscle in Daisy's body coiled like a spring. She'd faced this moment before different uniforms, different wars, different men who thought military rank gave them license to take whatever they wanted. But she'd never faced it from someone with this much power. Someone who could end her career with a word, who could destroy everything she'd worked for over the past 12 years of service. The general's fingers were an inch from her skin when she finally spoke, her voice steady and cold as winter steel. "Sir, I respectfully suggest you reconsider your current course of action." General Thorne's smile was a slash of white teeth in the shadows. "Or what, Private? You'll file a complaint? Report me to my commanding officer?" He leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear. "I am the commanding officer." I decide who succeeds in this program and who washes out. I decide who gets the plum assignments and who spends the rest of their career guarding supply depots in Nebraska. I decide everything that matters to your future, and right now, I'm deciding that your future depends on how cooperative you're willing to be. His hand finally made contact with her cheek, fingers trailing down toward her jaw, and Daisy felt the familiar ice-cold calm that had kept her alive through countless firefights settle over her like armor. She'd learned long ago that there were moments when following orders meant survival, and moments when survival meant breaking every rule in the book. This was one of the latter. "General," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of every battle she'd fought, every friend she'd lost, every line she'd been forced to cross in service to her country. "You're about to make a mistake you'll regret for the rest of your very short remaining career." The threat in Daisy's voice should have been warning enough, but General Thorne had built his career on the assumption that his rank made him untouchable. His smile widened as his other hand moved to her shoulder, fingers digging into the fabric of her uniform. "Threats, Private? From a soldier who's completely alone, in a place where no one will hear anything that happens. You're not thinking clearly." What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but would be replayed in security footage, witness testimony, and Daisy's own memory for years to come. As Thorne's grip tightened on her shoulder, she pivoted smoothly on her left foot, her right hand snapping up to catch his wrist. Her fingers found the pressure point she'd been taught during her first tour, technique that had disarmed more than one enemy combatant who thought physical intimidation would work on the compact woman with the deceptively gentle face. General's confident expression flickered to confusion, then to pain as Daisy applied precise pressure to the cluster of nerves in his wrist. But instead of releasing him and stepping back as military protocol would have demanded, she continued the movement, using his own forward momentum to spin him around and drive him face first into the concrete wall he'd been backing her against. Moments before, the sound of impact echoed through the warehouse like a gunshot, followed immediately by Thorne's sharp cry of pain and the distinct crack of his nose, breaking against the unforgiving concrete. Blood began streaming down his face as he stumbled backward, one hand pressed to his nose while the other hung limply at his side where Daisy had damaged the nerve cluster. "You psychotic bitch," he gasped, his cultured voice now nasal and thick. "With blood, do you have any idea what you've just done? I'll have you court-martialed, dishonorably discharged, thrown in military prison for assaulting a superior officer." Daisy stood perfectly at attention, her breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Sir, I defended myself against an unprovoked assault by a commanding officer who was attempting to coerce sexual favors through abuse of rank and authority. My actions were justified under Article 86 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which explicitly protects service members from sexual harassment and assault regardless of the rank of the perpetrator." The general's face went white beneath the blood, whether from pain or shock at her precise recital of military law. "No one will believe you. It's your word against mine." "Actually, sir, it's not." Daisy reached into her breast pocket and withdrew a small device no larger than a matchbook, a military-grade digital recorder that had been running throughout their entire conversation. "Everything you said tonight, every threat, every admission of using your position to coerce female soldiers, it's all recorded, clear as day." For the first time since entering the warehouse, General Marcus Thorne looked genuinely afraid. The blood dripping from his nose seemed insignificant compared to the growing realization that his career, his reputation, his entire life was now in the hands of a woman he'd tried to victimize. His good hand fumbled for his service weapon. But Daisy was already moving, her combat boot connected with his solar plexus in a perfectly executed front kick that sent him sprawling backward into a stack of supply crates. Wooden boxes crashed down around him as he struggled to breathe, his weapon flying from his hand to skitter across the concrete floor into the shadows. Daisy followed through with the fluid precision of someone who'd survived 3 combat tours by never hesitating when violence became necessary. The recorder is programmed to automatically upload to a secure server if I don't enter a specific code every 6 hours, she said conversationally as Thorne writhed among the scattered supplies. It's also equipped with GPS tracking, so there's a complete record of where this conversation took place. Even if something unfortunate were to happen to me, the evidence would still surface. She knelt beside the fallen general, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than his shouting had. Here's what's going to happen, General. You're going to clean yourself up and report to the base hospital for treatment of injuries sustained during a training accident. Tomorrow morning, you're going to announce that you're taking extended medical leave due to stress-related health issues. Within the week, you'll submit your retirement papers citing personal reasons. Thorne's eyes blazed with hatred and humiliation. And if I refuse? Daisy's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Then this recording gets transmitted to the Pentagon Inspector General, the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Secretary of Defense, and every major news network simultaneously. Your choice, sir. The warehouse fell silent again except for Thorne's labored breathing and the persistent drip from overhead. Outside, the sounds of the base at night continued, the distant hum of generators, the occasional vehicle passing on the perimeter road, the call of guards making their rounds. Normal sounds of military life continuing while the entire power structure of the Special Operations Training Program shifted in the darkness. Finally, General Thorne struggled to his feet, one hand still pressed to his bleeding nose. His uniform was torn and stained, his silver hair disheveled, his authority stripped away as completely as if he'd been demoted on the spot. You have no idea what you've started, Private Perry. I have allies, connections, people who owe me favors. This won't end here. I'm counting on it, Daisy replied, her voice steady. Because every move you make against me will be documented, and every ally who tries to help you will be implicated in covering up sexual harassment and abuse of power. You're not just fighting me anymore, General. You're fighting the entire military justice system, and the military takes a very dim view of officers who prey on their subordinates. She stepped aside and gestured toward the warehouse exit. Your choice, sir. Easy retirement with your pension intact, or complete public humiliation followed by court-martial and federal prison. But choose quickly. I have morning PT in 6 hours, and I need my sleep. General Thorne stared at her for a long moment, his pale gray eyes filled with a mixture of rage, fear, and grudging respect. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps no longer confident and predatory, but uncertain and defeated. Daisy waited until she heard his vehicle start and drive away before allowing herself to relax. She retrieved the general's service weapon from the shadows and checked the chamber loaded, safety off, ready to kill. The realization of how close she'd come to a far different ending sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cool night air flowing through the broken skylights. She secured the weapon in her belt beside her combat knife and began walking toward the exit, her mind already shifting to the challenges ahead. Taking down General Thorne was only the beginning of the man with his connections and resources wouldn't go quietly into retirement, and she'd made a powerful enemy who still had weeks or possibly months to destroy her career before his own downfall became public. But as she stepped out of the warehouse into the star-filled night, Daisy Perry felt something she hadn't experienced since her first combat tour, the satisfaction of fighting back against a system that had tried to break her. She'd spent years following orders, accepting that sexual harassment and abuse of power were just part of military culture, telling herself that keeping quiet was the price of serving her country. Tonight, that had changed. Tonight, she'd drawn a line in the sand and dared someone to cross it. And when General Marcus Thorne had crossed that line, she'd made him pay a price he'd never forget. The walk back to the barracks took 15 minutes. during which Daisy's mind raced through the possible consequences of her actions. Military. Justice moved slowly, but military gossip traveled at the speed of light. By morning formation, someone would notice the general's absence and injuries. Questions would be asked, rumors would spread, and eventually, the truth would surface. She could handle the official investigation. The recording provided ironclad evidence of Thorne's misconduct and justified her use of force in self-defense. But she couldn't control the unofficial retaliation, the whispered campaigns to destroy her reputation, the sudden reassignments and denied opportunities that would follow as Thorne's allies moved to protect themselves and punish her for exposing the corruption in their ranks. The barracks were dark and quiet when she slipped inside, her fellow recruits deep in the exhausted sleep that followed 18-hour training days. Daisy moved silently to her bunk in the corner, a habit developed during countless nights in forward operating bases where noise discipline meant the difference between life and death. Her footlocker contained the usual collection of personal items, photos from home, letters from family, the small mementos that kept soldiers connected to the world they'd left behind, but hidden in a compartment she'd built into the bottom of the locker was something more valuable than any personal memento, a complete dossier on General Marcus Thorne that she'd been assembling for the past 3 weeks. Names, dates, locations, financial records, photographs, everything she'd been able to gather about the man's official and unofficial activities. Since taking command of the Special Operations Program, she'd started the investigation as simple due diligence after hearing too many whispered stories about female soldiers who'd suddenly left the program under mysterious circumstances. But what she'd found was far worse than casual sexual harassment. It was a systematic pattern of abuse stretching back years, carefully hidden behind layers of military bureaucracy and protected by a network of officers who either participated in or turned a blind eye to Thorne's activities. The recording from tonight was just the latest piece of evidence in a file that could destroy not just Thorne, but a dozen other high-ranking officers who'd enabled his behavior. Which meant that her confrontation in the warehouse hadn't just made her an enemy of one corrupt general. It had made her a threat to an entire network of military officials who had too much to lose if the truth came to light. Daisy closed the footlocker and sat on her bunk, staring out the window at the distant lights of the base command center where General Thorne was probably at this moment trying to figure out how to destroy her before she could destroy him. The smart move would be to take her evidence to the proper authorities and let the military justice system handle the situation. But 12 years of military service had taught her that the system was often more interested in protecting itself than protecting individual soldiers, especially when those soldiers were asking inconvenient questions about powerful men. A soft sound from the bunk across the narrow aisle caught her attention. Sergeant Lisa Chun, a fellow special operations candidate who'd become something of a friend despite the competitive atmosphere of the training program. Chun was sitting up, her dark eyes alert and concerned in the dim light filtering through the windows. "Rough night?" Chun whispered, gesturing toward the mud and concrete dust on Daisy's uniform. Daisy considered lying, telling some story about extra training or equipment maintenance. But looking at Chun's face, another woman who'd clawed her way up through the military hierarchy by being twice as good as her male counterparts, while putting up with 10 times as much harassment, she made a decision that would change both their lives. "Sergeant Chun," she whispered back, "how do you feel about bringing down a few generals?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge and a promise. Chun's expression shifted from concern to intense interest, her tactical mind already working through the implications. In the darkness of the barracks, with their fellow soldiers sleeping peacefully around them, 2 women began planning a campaign that would shake the military establishment to its foundations. But first, they had to survive long enough to implement it. 3 hours before dawn, as Daisy finally drifted off to sleep with the digital recorder safely hidden in her gear, General Marcus Thorne was making phone calls to contacts throughout the Pentagon and beyond. The conversation in the warehouse had ended his career, but it hadn't ended his ability to destroy hers. By the time morning formation was called, the machinery of retaliation was already in motion. The war for justice was about to begin, and both sides were preparing for a battle that would determine not just the fate of Daisy Perry and Marcus Thorne, but the future of military culture itself. In the gray hour before dawn, as Fort Braxton prepared for another day of training elite soldiers, the first moves were being made in a conflict that would ultimately be decided not in some distant battlefield, but in the halls of power where truth and lies fought for supremacy. The digital recorder in Daisy's footlocker contained enough evidence to destroy a dozen careers and reform a system that had protected predators for decades. But evidence was only powerful if it reached the right people, and the right people were rapidly becoming aware that their comfortable world of protected corruption was under attack from a compact woman with gentle eyes and the tactical skills to bring down anyone who stood in her way. Morning would bring new challenges, new enemies, and new opportunities for justice. But it would also bring the consequences of choices made in a dark warehouse, where a general had tried to corner a soldier who refused to be cornered. The story of Daisy Perry was just beginning, and the military would never be the same. The first sign of retaliation came during morning formation, 6 hours after General Thorne had limped away from Warehouse 7 with his career in ruins and his nose streaming blood. Daisy stood at attention with the other 47 Special Operations candidates, her face impassive despite the churning tension in her gut, as she noticed the subtle changes in the base's routine. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the program's senior non-commissioned officer, paced the formation with unusual intensity, his weathered face set in harder lines than normal. Behind him, a cluster of officers she didn't recognize watched the proceedings. Men in crisp dress uniforms with the kind of chest candy that indicated high-level Pentagon assignments. Their presence during routine morning PT was unprecedented and ominous. "Listen up, candidates," Rodriguez barked, his voice carrying the authority of 25 years in special operations. Due to medical issues, General Thorne has been placed on indefinite leave. Colonel James Mitchell will assume temporary command of this training program, pending reassignment of permanent leadership. A murmur ran through the formation general. Thorne's absence was notable, but the medical excuse was thin enough to see through. Beside Daisy, Sergeant Chun's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that she too understood the implications of the sudden command change. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward, a tall man in his mid-50s with steel-gray hair and the lean build of someone who'd spent his career in combat units. His service record was impeccable: 3 combat tours, multiple commendations, a reputation for fairness and tactical brilliance. Under normal circumstances, Daisy would have been relieved to see Thorne replaced by someone with Mitchell's credentials. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Mitchell's first words confirmed her growing suspicions. This training program maintains the highest standards of military discipline and conduct, Mitchell announced, his pale blue eyes sweeping the formation before settling directly on Daisy. Any candidate who compromises those standards through inappropriate behavior, violation of the chain of command, or conduct unbecoming a soldier will be immediately removed from the program and subject to disciplinary action under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The message was clear, even without mentioning names. She was being warned that any attempt to pursue official complaints against Thorne would be treated as insubordination. Mitchell's presence meant that Thorne's allies were already moving to contain the damage, using their influence to install a commander who would protect the network rather than pursue justice. "Private Perry," Mitchell's voice cut through her analysis like a blade. "Report to my office at 0800 hours for individual assessment." Every eye in the formation turned toward her, some curious, others calculating. The other candidates knew something. Significant was happening. Generals didn't suddenly go on medical leave while their replacements singled out individual soldiers for special attention. But only Chun truly understood the stakes of what was unfolding. "Sir, yes sir," Daisy replied, her voice steady despite the knowledge that she was walking into what amounted to an ambush. Formation dismissed with the usual efficiency. Candidates scattering toward the mess hall for breakfast before beginning another day of grueling training. But Daisy noticed how several of her fellow soldiers gave her a wider berth than usual, the way people instinctively avoid someone who might be contaminated with career-ending trouble. Military communities were small and insular. Word traveled fast when someone crossed the wrong people, and most soldiers had learned to protect themselves by avoiding association with troublemakers. "Perry." Chun's quiet voice stopped her as she headed toward the administrative building. "Watch your back in there. Mitchell's got a reputation for loyalty to his superiors, and right now, his superiors have a vested interest in making sure your version of last night never sees daylight." Daisy nodded, touching the small device hidden in her breast pocket where the recording remained safely stored. "I'll be careful, but if something happens to me, you know what to do." They'd spent 2 hours before dawn planning contingencies, establishing secure communication protocols, and preparing for the retaliation they both knew was coming. Chun had military intelligence training and contacts throughout the Pentagon who owed her favors. If Daisy disappeared or suffered a convenient accident, the evidence would still surface. The walk to Mitchell's office took her through the heart of Fort Braxton, past the parade grounds where another company was conducting close-order drill, past the motor pool where mechanics worked on armored vehicles, past the dozens of buildings that housed one of the military's most prestigious training installations. The base represented everything she'd joined the Army to serve: discipline, honor, the defense of American values against enemies foreign and domestic. But walking through its familiar spaces now, Daisy couldn't shake the feeling that the enemy she faced wasn't foreign at all. It was sitting in administrative offices, wearing the same uniform she wore, protected by the same system that was supposed to protect her. Colonel Mitchell's office occupied a corner of the headquarters building, its windows overlooking the main parade ground and the distant mountains beyond the base perimeter. The man behind the desk was reviewing files when she knocked, his expression professional but cold when he looked up. Private Perry, at ease, closed the door. She complied, noting the way Mitchell positioned himself between her and the exit, a subtle psychological tactic designed to emphasize his control over the situation. The office walls displayed the usual collection of military memorabilia, unit patches, commendations, photographs from various assignments, but Daisy noticed several pictures that included General Thorne, evidence of a professional relationship that went back years. "Impressive service record," Mitchell began, opening a thick file folder. 3 combat tours, multiple commendations, specialty training in languages and cultural intelligence. The kind of soldier this program was designed for. He closed the folder and fixed her with a steady stare. "Which makes your recent behavior all the more disappointing." "Sir, I'm not sure what behavior you're referring to." Mitchell's smile was thin and humorless. "Of course you're not. Just like you're not sure how General Thorne sustained facial injuries during a training accident that somehow occurred in an abandoned warehouse at 0200 hours when no training was scheduled." The statement was a fishing expedition, an attempt to gauge how much she knew about the official story being constructed around Thorne's injuries. But it also revealed that they hadn't found her recording device if they had solid evidence of what really happened in the warehouse. Mitchell would have led with that instead of probing for information. "Sir, I was unaware that General Thorne had been injured. I hope he recovers quickly." "I'm sure you do." Mitchell leaned back in his chair, studying her with the kind of analytical focus she'd seen in interrogators during her intelligence training. "Tell me, Perry, what do you know about military discipline? About the importance of maintaining chain of command and respecting authority?" The question was loaded with implied threats, but Daisy had faced more dangerous interrogations in combat. Zones where the wrong answer meant death rather than just career destruction. Sir, I understand that military discipline requires following lawful orders and maintaining proper conduct at all times. I also understand that soldiers have a duty to refuse unlawful orders and report misconduct when they encounter it. Mitchell's expression darkened slightly. Misconduct is a serious allegation. The kind of allegation that requires solid evidence and proper channels. The kind of allegation that, if made without foundation, can destroy a soldier's career and reputation. Yes, sir. I understand the seriousness of making false accusations. Good, because I'd hate to see a promising soldier like you make career-ending mistakes based on misunderstandings or personal grievances. Mitchell stood and moved to the window, his back to her as he continued speaking. General Thorne has served this country with distinction for 30 years. His record is exemplary, his commitment to excellence beyond question. Any attempt to smear his reputation would be viewed very dimly by his many friends and colleagues throughout the military hierarchy. The threat was becoming more explicit, but Daisy noticed something else in Mitchell's tone: uncertainty. If Thorne's position was truly unassailable, there would be no need for these careful warnings and veiled intimidation. The fact that Mitchell was working so hard to discourage her from taking action suggested that Thorne's network was more vulnerable than they wanted to admit. Sir, I have no desire to smear anyone's reputation. I only want to complete my training and serve my country to the best of my ability. Mitchell turned back to face her, his expression showing a mixture of skepticism and calculation. Excellent. Then you'll have no problem signing this statement acknowledging that you've received counseling regarding proper conduct and chain of command protocols. He gestured to a document on his desk. Standard procedure for all candidates showing signs of stress or adjustment difficulties. Daisy approached the desk and scanned the document quickly. It was carefully worded legal language that would effectively prevent her from filing any future complaints about her treatment during the training program. Signing it wouldn't just silence her about Thorne, it would give his allies legal cover to claim she'd acknowledged problems with her own conduct rather than problems with theirs. Sir, I'd like to review this document more thoroughly before signing, perhaps with assistance from the base legal office to ensure I understand all the implications. Mitchell's facade of professional courtesy finally cracked, revealing the anger beneath. That won't be necessary, Private. This is a routine administrative matter, not a legal proceeding. Sign the document. Sir, with respect, I have the right to legal consultation before signing any statement that might affect my military record or future assignments. The colonel's face flushed red as he realized she wasn't going to be intimidated into signing away her rights. His voice dropped to a harsh whisper designed to emphasize the personal nature of the threat he was making. Perry, you seem to be under the impression that you have rights in this situation. Let me clarify something for you. I can have you removed from this program with a single phone call. I can have you reassigned to the most miserable posting in the military. I can ensure that your record is flagged with performance issues that will follow you for the rest of your career. Daisy met his stare without flinching. Drawing on 12 years of experience dealing with bullies who confused authority with power. Sir, you can certainly try to do those things. But any retaliation against me for refusing to sign an illegal document would itself be grounds for investigation by the Inspector General's office. And unlike accusations of misconduct, retaliation leaves a paper trail that's very difficult to cover up. For a moment, the office was silent except for the distant sounds of military life continuing outside, engines starting, voices calling out commands, the rhythmic sound of soldiers in formation. Mitchell stood frozen behind his desk, clearly recognizing that his intimidation tactics had not only failed, but had potentially made his situation worse by creating evidence of attempted coercion. The knock on the door broke the tension. Like a gunshot. Mitchell's secretary entered without waiting for permission, her expression urgent. "Sir, you have an emergency call from the Pentagon." They said it was regarding the Inspector General's investigation. Mitchell's face went white. The timing of the call was either an incredible coincidence or evidence that Daisy's allies were already moving to protect her. Either way, it completely undermined his attempt to present himself as holding all the cards in their confrontation. "Private Perry," he said through gritted teeth, "you're dismissed. Report to Sergeant Rodriguez for regular training duties. We'll continue this conversation at a later time." Daisy saluted crisply and turned toward the door, but Mitchell's voice stopped her before she could exit. "Perry, a word of advice from someone who served longer than you've been alive sometimes. The system protects people for good reasons. Sometimes rocking the boat puts everyone at risk, including innocent people who don't deserve to have their lives destroyed by someone else's crusade." She turned back to face him, recognizing the shift in his tone from threat to what might actually be genuine concern. "Sir, with respect, sometimes the system protects people for bad reasons. And sometimes innocent people are already having their lives destroyed by a system that values protecting powerful men over protecting the soldiers they're supposed to lead." The words hung in the air as she left the office, closing the door behind her with a soft click that somehow carried more finality than a slam would have. In the hallway outside, she could hear Mitchell's urgent conversation with whoever was calling from the Pentagon, his voice tight with stress as he tried to explain how a routine training program had suddenly become the subject of Inspector General scrutiny. Walking back toward the training areas, Daisy felt the familiar weight of approaching combat, the heightened awareness, the careful calculation of resources and threats, the knowledge that survival depended on making the right tactical decisions under extreme pressure. But this wasn't Afghanistan or Syria, where the enemies wore different uniforms and the rules of engagement were clearly defined. This was a war being fought in conference rooms and administrative offices, where weapons were wielded through official channels and casualties were measured in destroyed careers rather than body counts. The training day proceeded with deceptive normalcy, physical fitness testing, weapons maintenance, tactical exercises designed to push candidates to their limits. But beneath the routine, Daisy could feel the tension building as word of her confrontation with Mitchell spread through the informal networks that kept military communities informed. Some soldiers avoided her with obvious nervousness, others watched her with curious respect, and a few approached with quiet offers of support that carried significant personal risk. During the lunch break, Sergeant Chun appeared at her table with practiced casualness, sitting down with her meal tray as if their conversation was purely social. "Interesting morning," she commented between bites of regulation military cuisine. "Educational, Daisy." Agreed, keeping her voice equally casual despite the importance of the intelligence Sean was about to share. "Word is that someone filed a formal complaint with the IG's office early this morning. Anonymous tip about systemic misconduct in special operations training programs. Seems like they're taking it seriously enough to launch an immediate investigation." Daisy felt a surge of hope mixed with concern. An Inspector General investigation would provide official protection for her evidence and testimony, but it would also alert Thorne's network that their activities were under scrutiny. The next few days would be critical. Either the investigation would move fast enough to prevent retaliation, or her enemies would accelerate their timeline for destroying her credibility. Anyone have theories about who might have filed such a complaint? She asked. Chun's smile was subtle but unmistakable. "Military intelligence has some very dedicated people who take their oath to protect and defend seriously. People who understand that threats to military discipline don't always come from foreign enemies." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of training exercises that felt surreal given the larger conflict playing out around them. Daisy found herself working through combat scenarios while simultaneously calculating the political and legal implications of her situation. The mental juggling act was exhausting, but it was also familiar combat had taught her to process multiple threats simultaneously while maintaining focus on immediate objectives. As evening formation approached, she noticed increased activity around the command building, vehicles arriving and departing, officers in dress uniforms who didn't belong to the base's normal complement. The kind of heightened security that suggested very important people were having very important conversations about very sensitive topics. The formation itself was routine, until Master Sergeant Rodriguez announced that all training would be suspended the following day pending administrative review. The news sent a ripple of concern through the candidates. Suspended training meant their entire program was under scrutiny, which meant their futures were suddenly uncertain. After dismissal, Daisy walked back to the barracks with growing awareness that she was being watched. Not obviously, but with the kind of professional surveillance that suggested military intelligence or similar agencies. Whether they were protecting her or gathering intelligence on her activities was impossible to determine, but their presence meant that her confrontation with Thorne had attracted attention at levels far above base command. In her bunk, she checked the hidden recording device and found that it had successfully uploaded several data packets to the secure server Chun had established. Even if something happened to the physical device, multiple copies of the evidence now existed in secure locations beyond the reach of Thorne's allies. The knowledge provided some comfort, but also underscored how high the stakes had become. As lights out approached, Daisy lay in her narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the choice she'd made in that warehouse. Taking on General Thorne hadn't been a snap decision born of anger or frustration. It had been the culmination of years of watching the military. She loved protect predators while abandoning victims. The recording device, the carefully gathered evidence, the network of allies she'd cultivated, all of it represented a calculated campaign to change a system that seemed unchangeable. But systems didn't change without resistance, and the resistance was just getting started. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the investigation moved into high gear, and Thorne's network realized they were fighting for their survival. The sound of helicopters landing on the parade ground at 0300 hours confirmed what Daisy had suspected. This was no longer a local matter. As she watched through the barracks window, figures in civilian clothes emerged from the aircraft and were immediately escorted toward the command building by base security. The Inspector General's investigation was moving with unprecedented speed and resources, which meant someone very high in the Pentagon chain of command was taking her allegations seriously. But it also meant that General Thorne and his allies were running out of time to neutralize the threat she represented. In the darkness before dawn, as the base hummed with unusual activity, Daisy checked her gear one more time and prepared for what might be the most dangerous day of her military career. The war for justice was escalating, and she was about to find out just how far powerful men would go to protect their secrets. Dawn broke gray and cold over Fort Braxton, the kind of overcast morning that seemed to mirror the tension gripping the entire base. Daisy woke to the sound of increased vehicle traffic and the distant roar of more helicopters arriving throughout the night. Through the barracks windows, she could see military police establishing security perimeters around key buildings, their presence confirming that the Inspector General investigation had officially begun. Morning formation was canceled, replaced by an announcement over the base-wide communication system that all special operations candidates were confined to barracks, pending individual interviews with investigating officers. The message was delivered in the calm, professional tone that military personnel used to mask extraordinary circumstances. But every soldier on base understood the implications. Their training program was under investigation for serious misconduct, and their own careers might hang in the balance depending on what they knew and when they knew it. "This is bigger than we thought," Chun whispered as they watched teams of investigators establishing a command post in the building across from their barracks. That's not just IG personnel. I see FBI badges, Pentagon security, maybe even some people I recognize from military intelligence oversight. Someone called in every agency with jurisdiction over military criminal matters. Daisy nodded, her mind racing through the implications. A multi-agency investigation meant that her recording of General Thorne had triggered something much larger than simple sexual harassment allegations. The evidence she'd gathered over the past 3 weeks must have revealed connections to broader corruption, possibly involving defense contracts, classified information, or other federal crimes that fell under FBI jurisdiction. The first indication of how serious the situation had become arrived with breakfast. Instead of the usual mess hall routine, meals were delivered to the barracks by military police who also handed each candidate a legal notice informing them of their rights and the availability of military legal counsel. The documents were thick, formal, and written in the kind of language that made it clear this wasn't a routine administrative matter. Daisy was halfway through reading the legal notice when Sergeant Rodriguez appeared in the barracks doorway, his weathered face showing the strain of the past 24 hours. Behind him stood a woman in civilian clothes, tall, blonde, probably in her 40s, with the kind of quiet authority that suggested federal law enforcement. "Private Perry," Rodriguez called out, his voice carefully neutral. "You're requested for interview. This is Special Agent Sarah Kellerman from the FBI." The use of requested rather than ordered was significant. It meant they were treating her as a witness rather than a subject of investigation, at least for now. Daisy gathered her gear and followed them out of the barracks, noting how the other candidates watched her departure with mixtures of curiosity, concern, and relief that they weren't the ones being escorted away by federal agents. The walk to the command building took them past clusters of investigating personnel setting up equipment, interviewing base staff, and reviewing documents. The scale of the operation was impressive and intimidating. Whatever her recording had set in motion, it had drawn resources typically reserved for major national security investigations. Special Agent Kellerman remained silent during the walk, but her observant eyes missed nothing as she cataloged the base layout, security procedures, and the reactions of personnel to their passage. Daisy recognized the behavior from her own intelligence training. Kellerman was gathering information about the culture and environment that had allowed misconduct to flourish. The interview room was a converted office in the headquarters building, sterile and windowless except for a table, 3 chairs, and recording equipment that looked far more sophisticated than the device hidden in Daisy's gear. Kellerman gestured for her to sit, then activated the recording system with practiced efficiency. This interview is being conducted as part of a federal investigation into allegations of misconduct within military special operations training programs. Kellerman began, her voice professional but not unfriendly. "You are not under investigation at this time, but you should be aware that anything you say may be used as evidence in future proceedings. Do you understand your rights as outlined in the document you received this morning?" "Yes, ma'am, I understand." "Good. Let's start with your background. 12 years military service, 3 combat tours, exemplary record until your assignment to this training program 3 weeks ago. What changed?" The question was deceptively simple, but Daisy recognized the investigative technique. Start with easy questions to establish rapport, then gradually probe deeper into more sensitive areas. Her answer would set the tone for everything that followed. "Ma'am, nothing changed about my commitment to military service or my conduct as a soldier. What changed was my exposure to systematic misconduct by senior officers who were abusing their authority to exploit female personnel." Kellerman's expression remained neutral, but her pen moved rapidly as she took notes. "That's a serious allegation. Can you be more specific about what you observed?" For the next hour, Daisy walked through everything she'd witnessed, documented, and experience during her time in the Special Operations Program. She described the whispered warnings from other female soldiers, the pattern of mysterious reassignments and career derailments, the careful way junior officers avoided leaving their female subordinates alone with certain senior commanders. She reached the events in Warehouse 7. Kellerman's attention intensified. "You're alleging that General Marcus Thorne attempted to sexually assault you during what he claimed was a training evaluation." "Yes, ma'am. And I have evidence to support that allegation." Daisy produced the recording device from her gear, setting it carefully on the table between them. The entire conversation is recorded, including his explicit statements about using his position to coerce sexual favors and his threats to destroy my career if I refuse to comply. Kellerman's professional composure cracked slightly as she stared at the device. "You recorded a general officer without his knowledge during an alleged assault?" "Ma'am, I recorded a conversation that I suspected might involve illegal conduct. General Thorne's rank doesn't exempt him from federal laws regarding sexual harassment and assault." The special agent carefully bagged the recording device as evidence, but her expression suggested she understood the significance of what Daisy had just handed her. A clear recording of a general officer explicitly describing a pattern of sexual coercion would be devastating evidence in any legal proceeding. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "Private Perry, I need you to understand something," Kellerman said, her tone becoming more serious. "What you've just given me has the potential to destroy multiple careers and expose corruption that may reach very high levels of military command. Are you prepared for the consequences of that level of scrutiny?" Daisy met the agent's stare without flinching. "Ma'am, I'm prepared to face whatever consequences come from telling the truth about misconduct I've witnessed and experienced. I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution, and that includes defending it from enemies domestic as well as foreign." Kellerman nodded slowly, clearly impressed by the response. "Have you shared this evidence with anyone else?" "Yes, ma'am. I have allies who are aware of the situation and have access to copies of the evidence in case something happens to me." "Smart precaution, because I need to warn you that from this moment forward, you're likely to face significant pressure to recant your allegations or modify your testimony. People with a lot to lose are going to use every resource at their disposal to discredit you." As if summoned by her words, a knock on the interview room door interrupted their conversation. Sergeant Rodriguez entered, his expression grim, followed by a man Daisy didn't recognize, tall, silver-haired, wearing the kind of expensive civilian suit that suggested Washington, D.C. connections. "Special Agent Kellerman," the man said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm Deputy Secretary of Defense William Harrison. I need to speak with you privately about this investigation." Kellerman's expression hardened. "Mr. Harrison, this is an ongoing federal interview. Any discussion about the investigation will need to wait until I've completed my witness testimony." Harrison's smile was polite but cold. "I'm afraid that's not going to be possible. This investigation has raised national security concerns that require immediate attention. Private Perry will need to be debriefed by Pentagon security personnel before any further interviews can take place." The power play was obvious and illegal. Harrison was attempting to remove Daisy from FBI custody and place her under military control where her testimony could be managed or suppressed. But his presence also confirmed how seriously the Pentagon was taking her allegations. "Mr. Harrison," Kellerman replied, her voice ice cold, "this is a federal investigation with properly executed jurisdiction. Any attempt to interfere with my interviews or remove witnesses from federal custody would constitute obstruction of justice." The room fell silent as the two officials stared at each other, their confrontation representing a larger battle between military and civilian law enforcement over who would control the investigation. Daisy realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. Senior government officials engaged in a jurisdictional fight that could determine whether justice was served or covered up. Finally, Harrison stepped back, his expression showing grudging respect for Kellerman's refusal to be intimidated. "Very well. But I trust you understand the sensitive nature of this matter and the importance of handling classified information appropriately." After Harrison left, Kellerman resumed the interview with increased urgency. "Private Perry, it's clear that very powerful people are concerned about your testimony. Is there anything else you need to tell me before this investigation becomes even more complicated?" Daisy took a deep breath and made the decision that would transform her from witness to key intelligence asset in a federal investigation. "Ma'am, the recording from General Thorne is just part of a much larger pattern. I have evidence of financial irregularities, contract fraud, and possible espionage activities involving multiple senior officers in the Special Operations Command structure." Kellerman's pen stopped moving as she processed the implications. "Espionage? You're talking about potential treason charges?" "Yes, ma'am. And I believe General Thorne's abuse of female personnel was being used as leverage to secure their silence about other criminal activities they may have witnessed." The interview continued for another 2 hours as Daisy systematically presented evidence she'd gathered about corruption, reaching far beyond sexual harassment. Financial records showing unexplained payments, photographs of meetings with foreign nationals, communication intercepts suggesting classified information was being sold to hostile governments. When they finally finished, Kellerman looked like someone who just realized she was investigating not just misconduct, but possibly one of the largest military corruption scandals in recent history. "Private Perry, you need to understand that what you've just told me changes everything. This is no longer just about sexual harassment. You're describing a criminal conspiracy that could affect national security. Are you absolutely certain about these allegations?" "Ma'am, I'm certain about what I observed and documented. Whether it constitutes the level of conspiracy you're describing will be for investigators and prosecutors to determine." Kellerman nodded grimly. "You're going to need protection. The people you're accusing have resources and connections that make them extremely dangerous when they feel cornered." As if to emphasize her point, the building's fire alarm began blaring, followed immediately by announcements ordering all personnel to evacuate due to a security incident. Through the interview room's small window, Daisy could see military, police and FBI agents running toward the barracks area, their weapons drawn. "Stay close to me," Kellerman ordered, drawing her own service weapon as they joined the evacuation. "This could be a diversion designed to separate you from federal protection." The evacuation revealed the full scope of the investigation that had descended on Fort Braxton. Dozens of federal agents, military investigators, and Pentagon officials all working with urgent coordination that suggested they were racing against time to prevent evidence from being destroyed or witnesses from being silenced. But as they reached the evacuation assembly area, Daisy realized that the security incident had served its purpose. Sergeant Chun was nowhere to be found among the candidates from their barracks, and several other female soldiers who might have had relevant testimony were also missing from the formation. "Agent Kellerman," she said quietly, "we have a problem. Some of the other potential witnesses have disappeared." The FBI agent's expression darkened as she quickly counted heads and confirmed Daisy's assessment. "This isn't a security incident, it's a cleanup operation. Someone's moving to eliminate witnesses before they can testify." The war for justice had just escalated to kidnapping and possibly murder, and Daisy found herself at the center of a federal investigation that was turning into a race to save lives and preserve evidence before powerful enemies could destroy both. The next few hours transformed Fort Braxton from a military training facility into what resembled a crime scene. From a federal investigation. FBI agents established secure communication lines, military police cordoned off entire sections of the base, and helicopter patrols began circling the perimeter to prevent anyone from leaving without authorization. Special Agent Kellerman assigned 2 federal marshals to provide personal protection for Daisy, recognizing that she had become the most critical witness in an investigation that was rapidly expanding beyond anyone's initial expectations. The marshals were professionals, former military themselves. They understood both the tactical environment and the political implications of what was unfolding. "Ma'am," Marshal James Wright briefed her as they established a secure location in the base communications center. "We've got reports that several vehicles left the base during the evacuation. We're tracking them, but it's possible that missing witnesses were removed from federal jurisdiction before we could secure their safety." The implications were chilling. If Thorne's allies were willing to kidnap potential witnesses to prevent their testimony, they were facing opponents who viewed murder as an acceptable option for protecting their conspiracy. Daisy had expected career retaliation and legal challenges, but she hadn't anticipated that her pursuit of justice might cost people their lives. "What about Sergeant Chun?" she asked. "She was my closest ally in gathering evidence. If they have her... We're treating her disappearance as a priority kidnapping case," Kellerman replied, joining their conversation. "But right now, our immediate concern is keeping you alive and gathering enough evidence to prosecute everyone involved in this conspiracy." Over the next several hours, Daisy found herself at the center of the most intensive federal investigation she'd ever witnessed. Teams of agents worked around the clock to analyze the evidence she'd provided, trace financial transactions, identify co-conspirators, and build cases that would stand up in federal court. The scope of corruption they uncovered was staggering. General Thorne's abuse of female personnel was just one component of a larger criminal enterprise that included defense contract fraud, the sale of classified information to foreign governments, and the systematic theft of military resources for personal profit. The network involved dozens of officers across multiple bases and command structures, protected by a culture of silence and intimidation that had operated for years. But the most disturbing discovery came when FBI forensic accountants traced the financial flows associated with the conspiracy. The money wasn't just going into personal accounts. Significant portions were being funneled to offshore organizations with connections to hostile foreign governments. What had started as a sexual harassment case had evolved into a counterintelligence investigation with national security implications. Private Perry. Kellerman called her into a secure conference room where multiple federal agencies had established a joint operations center. "We need your help identifying locations and individuals that might be relevant to the broader conspiracy. Your intelligence training and access to the special operations community makes you uniquely qualified to help us understand what we're dealing with." The next phase of Daisy's involvement transformed her from witness to active participant in the investigation. Working with FBI agents, military intelligence officers, and Pentagon investigators, she helped map the network of corruption that had infected multiple levels of the military hierarchy. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Every piece of evidence they uncovered revealed new threats, new co-conspirators, new victims who had been silenced or eliminated to protect the conspiracy. Several times during the investigation, attempts were made to breach the security perimeter around Fort Braxton, suggesting that hostile intelligence services were actively trying to prevent the exposure of their military assets. But the most personal threat came in the form of a message delivered through official military channels, a transfer order assigning Daisy to an isolated communications post in Alaska, effective immediately, with instructions to report for transportation. That evening, the order carried the proper authorizations and signatures, but its timing made it obvious that someone was trying to remove her from federal protection using legitimate military procedures. "They're getting desperate," Kellerman observed as they reviewed the transfer order. "This is sloppy using official channels. To remove a federal witness creates a paper trail that actually helps our investigation." But desperation also made Thorne's network more dangerous. As evening approached, intelligence reports suggested that hostile forces were positioning themselves around the base, possibly preparing for an attempt to eliminate key witnesses or destroy critical evidence. The situation reached crisis level when military communications intercepted encrypted messages indicating that an assault on Fort Braxton was being planned for that night. The messages were traced to foreign intelligence operatives working in coordination with compromised American military officers, confirming that the conspiracy had expanded far beyond domestic corruption. "We're moving you to a secure federal facility," Kellerman announced as emergency preparations began. "This base is no longer safe for witnesses or evidence." But as they prepared for evacuation, an explosion rocked the communications center, followed immediately by the sound of automatic weapons fire from the base perimeter. The assault had begun earlier than expected, and Daisy found herself trapped in the middle of what amounted to a battle between federal law enforcement and a combination of military traitors and foreign operatives. The next few hours would test everything she'd learned during 3 combat tours. But this time she was fighting not just for her own survival, but for the evidence that could expose a conspiracy threatening the very foundations of military integrity. As gunfire echoed across Fort Braxton and federal agents scrambled to protect witnesses and preserve evidence, Daisy Perry prepared for what might be the most important battle of her military career, a fight for justice that had escalated into a shooting war between patriots and traitors on American soil. The investigation had uncovered more than anyone expected, and the enemies of justice were willing to kill to keep their secrets buried. But they had underestimated the determination of a compact woman with gentle eyes who had never backed down from a fight in her life, and who wasn't about to start now. The explosion that rocked Fort Braxton at 2,147 hours wasn't random. It was a precisely coordinated assault designed to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence before the federal investigation could expose the full scope of military corruption. As emergency lighting flickered to life throughout the communications center, Daisy found herself facing the kind of tactical situation she'd trained for during 3 combat tours, but with stakes that went far beyond personal survival. "Contact! Front!" Marshal Wright shouted as automatic weapons fire erupted from the main gate area. "Multiple hostiles, coordinated assault pattern. We need to move the witness to secondary secure location." Through the reinforced windows of the communications center, Daisy could see muzzle flashes and tracer rounds crisscrossing the base parade ground. The attackers had military training and equipment. Their movement patterns and fire discipline suggested special operations capabilities rather than random terrorists or criminals. Special Agent Kellerman was coordinating federal response through encrypted communications while simultaneously organizing the evacuation of critical evidence. "All units, this is Control. We have hostile forces breaching the perimeter at multiple points. Priority is witness protection and evidence preservation. Authorization given for lethal force." The institutional response was impressive, but Daisy's tactical instincts told her they were facing opponents who had planned this operation with inside knowledge of the base layout, security procedures, and federal protective measures. Someone with intimate knowledge of the investigation had provided intelligence to help the assault team maximize their effectiveness. "Agent Kellerman," she called out over the sound of approaching gunfire, "this isn't a random attack. They know exactly where we are, what evidence we have, and how we're likely to respond. We have a mole in the investigation." Kellerman's expression showed she'd reached the same conclusion. "Which means our standard evacuation procedures may be compromised. We need alternative solutions." The alternative came in the form of Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who appeared in the doorway of the communications center with a squad of base security personnel. His weathered face was grim but determined as he assessed the tactical situation. "Ma'am," he addressed Kellerman, "I've got 23 loyal personnel who can secure this building while you evacuate your witness and evidence. But we can't hold against a coordinated assault indefinitely." The appearance of Rodriguez represented a crucial decision point for Daisy. Throughout the investigation, she'd wondered about his loyalty as the senior non-commissioned officer for the Special Operations Program. He had to have known about at least some of the misconduct she'd exposed. His offer of protection could be genuine, or it could be a trap designed to deliver her into the hands of Thorne's allies. But tactical situations demanded quick decisions based on incomplete information, and Rodriguez's service record and reputation suggested he was more likely to be a frustrated witness to corruption than an active participant. The alternative, trusting entirely to federal protection that had already been compromised, seemed more dangerous than accepting help from military personnel with intimate knowledge of the base. "Sergeant Rodriguez," she said, making the choice. "That would determine her survival. What's your assessment of the hostile force capabilities?" Rodriguez moved to the windows and studied the enemy fire patterns with professional expertise. "Ma'am, I count at least 2 squads of trained personnel using military weapons and tactics. They've disabled our main communication systems, neutralized perimeter security, and positioned themselves to cut off standard evacuation routes. This isn't insurgents or criminals, this is a military operation." The confirmation that they were facing military-level opposition rather than random attackers had serious implications for both the immediate tactical situation and the broader investigation. If foreign intelligence services were willing to conduct armed assaults on American military bases to protect their assets, the conspiracy was far more dangerous than anyone had realized. "Agent Kellerman," Daisy said, "we need to consider that this attack isn't just about silencing witnesses. They may be trying to recover classified information or eliminate evidence of foreign intelligence operations." As if to confirm her assessment, a new series of explosions erupted from the direction of the base archives and record storage facilities. The attackers weren't just trying to kill witnesses. They were systematically destroying any physical evidence that could link their conspiracy to foreign governments. "Ma'am," Marshal Wright reported from his position monitoring federal communications, "we've lost contact with the evidence processing team at the archives building. Last transmission indicated they were under direct assault." The loss of evidence represented a potential catastrophe for the investigation. Without physical proof of the financial transactions, communication intercepts, and classified document thefts, the case against Thorne's network would rely entirely on witness testimony. That could be challenged in court, but it also represented an opportunity. If the assault team was focusing their efforts on destroying evidence, they might be vulnerable to counterattack by personnel they didn't expect to fight back. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Daisy said, her mind shifting into the tactical planning mode that had kept her alive through multiple combat tours. "What kind of defensive capabilities do we have available?" Rodriguez's grin was fierce and predatory. "Ma'am, this base has been training special operations personnel for 15 years. We've got weapons, explosives, and people who know how to use them. Most importantly, we've got personnel who are tired of watching corruption destroy the institution they've dedicated their lives to serve." The next hour transformed the communication center into a tactical operations center as loyal military personnel joined with federal agents to coordinate the defense of Fort Braxton. Maps were spread across tables, weapons were distributed to anyone qualified to use them, and communication networks were established using backup systems the attackers hadn't anticipated. Daisy found herself serving as both protected witness and tactical advisor, her combat experience and intelligence training making her invaluable for analyzing enemy capabilities and planning countermeasures. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same skills that had made her a target for sexual harassment were now essential for defending the investigation that could expose the harassment. The counterattack began at 0030 hours with a coordinated assault on the enemy positions around the archives building. Federal agents provided precision fire support, while loyal military personnel used their knowledge of base layout to approach enemy positions from unexpected angles. Daisy was part of the assault team that fought its way into the archives building, where they discovered evidence that confirmed the worst fears about the conspiracy. The attackers had been systematically destroying records, but their operation was incomplete. Enough evidence remained to prove that classified military information had been sold to foreign governments for years. But the real discovery came when they captured one of the assault team members alive. Under interrogation, the prisoner revealed that the attack was indeed a joint operation between compromised American military officers and foreign intelligence services. More importantly, he revealed that General Thorne was not the leader of the conspiracy. He was merely a mid-level participant in a network that reached much higher into the Pentagon hierarchy. Jesus Christ! Agent Kellerman breathed as she reviewed the prisoner's testimony. We're not just dealing with corrupt officers. We're dealing with a spy ring that's been operating inside the highest levels of military command. The revelation transformed the investigation once again. What had started as a sexual harassment case had become a counterintelligence operation with implications for national security. But it also meant that the enemies they faced had resources and connections that could reach anywhere in the government or military. As dawn broke over Fort Braxton, the immediate assault had been repelled, but the larger war for justice was entering its most dangerous phase. The evidence they'd preserved would be enough to expose the conspiracy, but only if they could get it to authorities who hadn't been compromised by years of foreign intelligence infiltration. Private Perry, Kellerman said as they prepared for evacuation to a secure federal facility, I need you to understand something. What we've uncovered is going to shake the foundations of military and government leadership. The people we're going after have the power to destroy careers, eliminate witnesses, and cover up evidence at levels we can barely comprehend. Daisy nodded, understanding the implications better than most. Ma'am, I've spent 12 years serving my country. I've seen what happens when good people stay silent while bad people destroy institutions from within. Whatever the cost, this conspiracy has to be exposed. But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if she truly understood what the cost might be. The attack on Fort Braxton had demonstrated that their enemies were willing to commit acts of war on American soil to protect their secrets. The evidence they'd gathered could bring down dozens of high-ranking officials and expose foreign intelligence operations that had been active for years. The question now was whether the American justice system was strong enough to handle a conspiracy that had infected its own protectors, and whether witnesses like herself could survive long enough to see justice served. As they prepared to leave Fort Braxton under heavy federal protection, Daisy looked back at the base where she'd expected to complete special operations training, and instead had uncovered one of the largest military corruption scandals in modern history. The buildings were scarred by battle damage, but the institution they represented, the military she'd dedicated her life to serving, might survive if the truth could be told. But first, they had to stay alive long enough to tell it. And with enemies at the highest levels of government and hostile foreign services working to silence them, survival was going to require every skill she'd learned. During 12 years of military service, the war for justice was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The secure federal facility outside Washington, D.C., looked more like a fortress than a government building. Its reinforced concrete walls and sophisticated surveillance systems, designed to protect the most sensitive intelligence operations in the country. But as Daisy was escorted through multiple security checkpoints in the pre-dawn darkness, she couldn't shake the feeling that even here, surrounded by federal marshals and FBI agents, She wasn't truly safe from the conspiracy she'd exposed. Past 72 hours had transformed her from a special operations candidate into the key witness in what media outlets were calling the largest military corruption scandal since Watergate. But the media didn't know the full story, the foreign intelligence connections, the systematic betrayal of classified information, the murders disguised as accidents that had silenced previous witnesses. Special Agent Kellerman looked exhausted as she briefed Daisy on the latest developments in the investigation. Dark circles under her eyes testified to 3 sleepless days of coordinating a case that grew more complex and dangerous with each piece of evidence uncovered. The good news is that we've identified 37 officers involved in the conspiracy, traced financial transactions totaling over $50 million, and documented the transfer of classified information to at least 4 hostile foreign governments, Kellerman reported. The bad news is that we've also identified the bodies of 6 potential witnesses who died in suspicious circumstances over the past 2 years. The revelation hit Daisy like a physical blow. 6 people had died because they'd known what she knew, seen what she'd seen, and tried to do what she was doing. The weight of that knowledge settled on her shoulders like lead. The understanding that her pursuit of justice had a body count that included people who'd never had the chance to tell their stories. Who were they? She asked quietly. Kellerman opened a file folder and began reading names that would haunt Daisy for the rest of her life. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, found dead in her quarters from apparent drug overdose except toxicology showed she'd been forcibly injected. Captain Jennifer Walsh, killed in a single car accident on a straight highway in perfect weather conditions. Lieutenant Colonel David Chun. Chun? Daisy interrupted, recognizing the surname. Any relation to Sergeant Lisa Chun? Her older brother. He was investigating financial irregularities in defense contracts when he suffered fatal injuries in what was ruled a training accident. Sergeant Chun joined the Special Operations Program specifically to investigate what happened to him. The revelation explains so much about Chun's motivations and her willingness to risk her career helping Daisy gather evidence, but it also meant that Chun's disappearance during the Fort Braxton attack wasn't random. She'd been specifically targeted because her investigation threatened people who had already killed to protect their secrets. Agent Kellerman, we have to find her. If she's still alive, we're doing everything possible, Kellerman assured her. But right now, our priority is preparing your testimony for the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing tomorrow. Your evidence is the foundation of this entire case. The Senate hearing represented both the culmination of their investigation and its most dangerous moment. Testifying before Congress would provide constitutional protection that made it virtually impossible for the conspiracy to suppress her evidence. But it would also make her a public target for retaliation by enemies who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill. The hearing preparation consumed the entire day, as federal prosecutors walked Daisy through her testimony line by line, anticipating every possible challenge or objection that might be raised by senators with connections to the conspiracy. The process was exhausting and frustrating, requiring her to relive traumatic experiences while maintaining the clinical precision necessary for effective legal testimony. But the real challenge came that evening when Marshal Wright burst into the conference room with news that changed everything. "Ma'am, we've got a problem," he announced, his usual professional calm cracked by obvious stress. 3 senators on the Armed Services Committee have just announced they're recusing themselves from tomorrow's hearing due to potential conflicts of interest. The implications were immediately clear to everyone in the room. If 3 senators were recusing themselves, it meant the investigation had uncovered evidence linking them to the conspiracy. But it also meant the hearing might lack the political support necessary to ensure justice was served. Which senators? Kellerman demanded. Senators Morrison, Bradley, and Hutchinson. All 3 have received significant campaign contributions from defense contractors that we've linked to the financial fraud aspects of the conspiracy. Daisy felt the familiar chill of approaching combat as she realized the full scope of what they were facing. The conspiracy hadn't just infected military leadership. It had corrupted the civilian oversight mechanisms that were supposed to provide checks and balances against military misconduct. "Agent Kellerman," she said, "how many people in positions of authority can we actually trust?" The question hung in the air like an accusation against the entire system they were trying to use to achieve justice. After a long moment, Kellerman answered with brutal honesty. "I don't know. And that's what makes tomorrow so dangerous." The danger materialized at 0300 hours when the facility's alarm system began screaming warnings about perimeter breaches. Daisy woke to the sound of automatic weapons fire and the sight of federal marshals rushing through the corridors with weapons drawn. "Multiple hostiles," Wright reported as he burst into her secure room. "Professional assault team, military tactics, and equipment. We need to evacuate you immediately." But as they moved toward the evacuation route, explosions began detonating throughout the facility with precision that suggested intimate knowledge of the building's structure and security systems. The attackers weren't trying to fight their way in, they were trying to bring the entire building down on top of everyone inside. "This isn't an assassination attempt," Daisy realized as debris rained down from ceiling-mounted explosives. "This is demolition. They're trying to eliminate all the evidence and witnesses simultaneously." The realization transformed their tactical situation from defensive to desperate. Instead of trying to repel an assault, they were trying to escape from a building that was systematically being destroyed around them. The attackers had apparently decided that killing Daisy and the federal agents wasn't enough. They needed to eliminate every piece of physical evidence that could connect the conspiracy to foreign intelligence services. The next hour was a nightmare of smoke, debris, and running battles through corridors that were collapsing behind them as they fled. Daisy found herself drawing on every survival skill she'd learned during 3 combat tours. But this time she was fighting not just for her own life, but for the preservation of evidence that could expose treason at the highest levels of government. They made it to the parking garage as the main building collapsed in a shower of concrete and steel, the destruction so complete that any evidence stored inside would be impossible to recover. But as they reached their armored vehicles, a new horror awaited them. Special Agent Kellerman was slumped over the steering wheel of the lead vehicle, a single bullet hole in her forehead and her service weapon missing from its holster. The woman who had risked her career and life to investigate military corruption had been executed by someone with access to the secure facility. The parking garage echoed with the sound of Marshal Wright's warning as Daisy dove behind an armored vehicle, her mind processing the tactical situation with the cold clarity that had kept her alive through countless firefights. Special Agent Kellerman's body slumped in the driver's seat told a story more chilling than the building collapse they'd just escaped. Someone with authorized access had executed the lead federal investigator at point-blank range. Multiple shooters, Wright whispered into his radio as sniper rounds sparked off concrete around them. Professional setup, coordinated timing. They knew exactly when and where we'd emerge. Daisy crawled toward Kellerman's vehicle, keeping low as bullets whined overhead. The FBI agent's eyes stared sightlessly at the garage ceiling, but her right hand was clenched around something, a small object that might be their only hope of survival. "Right," she called softly. "Kellerman's got something." "Cover me." The marshal laid down suppressing fire while Daisy reached into the vehicle and pried open Kellerman's fingers. Inside was a USB drive marked with federal evidence tags, the backup copy of everything they'd discovered about the conspiracy. Even in death, the agent had protected the most critical evidence, but survival required more than evidence. As concrete chips rained down from sniper fire, Daisy assessed their tactical situation with professional despair. They were trapped in an underground garage with no cover, facing an unknown number of professional shooters who had unlimited time to eliminate them. The solution came from an unexpected source. Her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from a contact she'd never expected to hear from again. Basement level, service tunnel behind electrical room. Chun is alive. Move now. Rodriguez, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, had somehow survived the chaos at Fort Braxton and tracked them to the federal facility. More importantly, he'd found Sergeant Lisa Chun, the missing witness whose disappearance had haunted Daisy since the attack on the base. "Right, we've got an extraction route," she whispered, showing him the message. "But we need to reach the basement level." The marshal studied the garage layout, calculating angles of fire and movement patterns with professional expertise. "That's 2 levels down through hostile territory. We'll be exposed for at least 30 seconds on each stairwell. Then we make those 30 seconds count." What followed was a running gun battle through a collapsing federal facility, with Daisy and Wright fighting their way through corridors filled with smoke and debris while sniper fire tracked their movement. The USB drive in Daisy's pocket seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds, the evidence of treason and murder that dozens of people had died to protect or expose. They reached the basement level as the building's superstructure began its final collapse. Steel beams groaning and concrete walls cracking under impossible stress. The service tunnel Rodriguez had identified was barely wide enough for one person, a maintenance access that had been overlooked by the assault team's demolition plan. "Perry, right. This way," Rodriguez's voice echoed from the tunnel entrance. Barely audible over the sound of destruction above, they crawled through 50 yards of narrow tunnel as the federal facility collapsed completely behind them, emerging into the storm drainage system beneath the Capital District. Rodriguez waited with 3 other soldiers Daisy recognized from Fort Braxton loyal personnel, who had risked everything to extract them from certain death. But the most important person in the tunnel was Sergeant Lisa Chen, alive but bearing obvious signs of torture and interrogation. Her face was bruised and swollen, her left arm in an improvised sling, but her dark eyes burned with the same determination that had driven her investigation into her brother's murder. "They wanted to know everything about our evidence," Chun whispered as they moved through the drainage tunnels toward an extraction point. "How much we knew, who else was involved, where we'd hidden backup copies. I didn't tell them about the server farm." Daisy felt a surge of hope mixed with admiration for her friend's courage under torture. "Server farm?" "Military intelligence operates a secure data storage facility that automatically backs up communications from federal investigations. Everything, recordings, documents, testimonies, it's all preserved in a location they can't access." The revelation transformed their situation from desperate to potentially victorious. Even if they'd destroyed the federal facility and eliminated key witnesses, the conspiracy couldn't erase digital evidence stored in military intelligence archives, but reaching those archives would require surviving long enough to access them. And their enemies had demonstrated resources and ruthlessness that suggested no place in the capital was truly safe. They emerged from the storm drains into an abandoned warehouse district at dawn, the sunrise painting Washington, D.C. in shades of gold that seemed to mock the darkness of the conspiracy they'd uncovered. Rodriguez had vehicles waiting, nondescript, civilian cars that wouldn't attract the attention of hostiles scanning for federal transportation. "Ma'am," Rodriguez addressed Daisy as they prepared to move, "we've got maybe 6 hours before they realize you're still alive and start hunting systematically. The Senate hearing is scheduled for 1400 hours, but most of the senators don't know the facility was destroyed or that Agent Kellerman is dead." The timing was critical. If they could reach the Capitol and present their evidence before the conspiracy realized they'd survived, they might achieve the constitutional protection that came with congressional testimony. But if their enemies discovered they were alive, the entire government could be mobilized to silence them before the truth emerged. "Chun," Daisy said. "Can you handle testifying about your brother's murder and the torture you've endured?" Chun's battered face was set in lines of determination that reminded Daisy of her own expression in the warehouse, where this had all started. "I've been waiting 2 years for the chance to tell the world who killed David and why. They'll have to kill me to stop me from testifying." The drive to Capitol Hill took them through a city that looked normal on the surface but felt charged with dangerous tension. News reports on the radio mentioned the tragic explosion that had destroyed a federal facility, but there was no mention of casualties or the investigation that had been housed there. The cover-up was already in motion, reality being rewritten to protect the conspiracy. But as they approached the Capitol building, Daisy began to notice signs that their enemies were mobilizing faster than expected. Military vehicles at intersections where they shouldn't be. Federal agents with earpieces positioned at locations that suggested surveillance operations. Helicopters circling the Capitol with unusual persistence. "We've got a problem, right?" observed from the passenger seat. Someone's turned the entire district into a hunting ground. The realization that they were driving into a trap came too late. As their lead vehicle rounded the corner onto Constitution Avenue, automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions, turning their windshield into spider web patterns of safety glass. "Ambush!" Rodriguez shouted, yanking the steering wheel hard left as bullets punched through the vehicle's doors. "They're using federal assets to eliminate us." What followed was a high-speed chase through the streets of Washington, D.C., with corrupt federal agents and military personnel openly hunting witnesses to treason on American soil. The pursuit was surreal and terrifying. The same agencies that were supposed to protect justice had been turned into weapons against it, but Rodriguez and his team had prepared for this contingency. As enemy vehicles closed in from multiple directions, he guided their convoy toward a predetermined rally point where loyal military personnel had established a defensive perimeter. The rally point was the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, chosen because it was a location where armed conflict would be witnessed by hundreds of civilians and impossible to cover up. If their enemies wanted to silence them, they would have to do it in front of tourists, school groups, and media cameras. The battle that erupted at the memorial was brief but decisive. Loyal military personnel, federal agents who had remained uncorrupted, and local police who understood they were witnessing an attempted coup engaged in a firefight with traitors who were trying to murder witnesses to protect foreign intelligence. Operations. When the smoke cleared, 12 corrupt officials were dead or in custody, their communications equipment revealing coordination with hostile foreign governments. The evidence of treason was so overwhelming that even sympathetic media outlets couldn't suppress the story. But the most important outcome was that Daisy Perry, Lisa Chun, and Marshall Wright had survived to reach the Senate Armed Services Committee. Hearing that would change American history. The hearing room was packed beyond capacity, with senators, media representatives, and military officials filling every available seat. The morning's violence had transformed what was supposed to be a routine investigation into the most significant national security hearing since the McCarthy era. Senator Patricia Williams, the committee chairwoman, called for order as cameras rolled and the nation watched. This hearing will examine allegations of systematic corruption within military special operations programs, including potential treason involving the transfer of classified information to hostile foreign governments. Daisy sat at the witness table feeling the weight of history and the stares of hundreds of people whose lives would be changed by her testimony. The USB drive containing Kellerman's final evidence was secured in the committee's possession, but the most powerful testimony would come from living witnesses who had seen the corruption firsthand. "Private Perry," Senator Williams began, "please tell this committee in your own words how a routine training assignment led to the discovery of one of the most serious military corruption scandals in modern American history." For the next 4 hours, Daisy presented her evidence with the precision of a military briefing, and the passion of someone who had lost friends to the conspiracy she was exposing. She detailed General Thorne's sexual harassment and abuse of power, the systematic cover-up by his superiors, the financial fraud involving defense contracts, and the sale of classified information to foreign intelligence services. But the most powerful moment came when she played the recording of her confrontation with Thorne in Warehouse 7. The general's own words, captured with perfect clarity, revealed not just his personal misconduct, but his casual references to a network of corruption that reached the highest levels of military command. "You're not just fighting me anymore, General," her recorded voice echoed through the hearing room. "You're fighting the entire military justice system, and the military takes a very dim view of officers who prey on their subordinates." The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Those words, spoken in defiance of a corrupt general, had proven prophetic. She hadn't just been fighting Thorne. She'd been fighting a system that had protected predators and traitors for years. Sergeant Chun's testimony provided the personal dimension that statistics and financial records couldn't capture. Her voice broke as she described finding her brother's body after his training accident, her subsequent investigation that revealed he'd been murdered for discovering the conspiracy, and the torture she'd endured when the network tried to silence her. "They told me my brother died for nothing," Chun said, tears streaming down her bruised face. "They said no one would ever know or care about what he'd discovered. But they were wrong. David died protecting classified information from foreign enemies, and today the whole world knows it." The committee's questioning revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. 53 officers involved in various aspects of the corruption, over $200 million in fraudulent defense contracts, and classified information that had compromised ongoing operations in 7 different countries. But the most shocking revelation came when Senator Williams read from the server farm data that Chun had preserved. The conspiracy had included detailed plans for a military coup if their corruption was exposed, including the assassination of congressional leaders and the declaration of martial law. "Ladies and gentlemen," Senator Williams announced, "we are not just dealing with corruption or even treason. We are dealing with a conspiracy that threatened the very foundations of American democracy." The Senate hearing triggered the largest investigation in military history, with over 300 officers facing charges ranging from sexual harassment to treason. General Marcus Thorne, arrested at a private medical facility where he'd been hiding since the warehouse confrontation, became the star witness in exchange for a reduced sentence, revealing details about foreign intelligence operations that had been active for over a decade. But for Daisy Perry, the most important outcome was the systematic reform of military culture that followed the exposure of the conspiracy. New regulations protecting whistleblowers, mandatory reporting requirements for sexual harassment, and civilian oversight of military justice proceedings transformed the institution she dedicated her life to serving. 6 months after the Senate hearing, she stood in the same warehouse where her confrontation with Thorne had begun. But this time she was accompanied by a congressional delegation reviewing the implementation of military reforms. The facility had been converted into a training center for military ethics and whistleblower protection. "Private Perry," Senator Williams said as they toured the facility, "do you have any regrets about the choices you made?" Daisy considered the question carefully. Her actions had resulted in the downfall of dozens of military officers, the exposure of foreign intelligence operations, and the deaths of people who had tried to silence the truth. The personal cost had been enormous. She would never be able to serve in special operations. Her military career was effectively over, and she would spend the rest of her life under federal protection from enemies who blamed her for their exposure. But she also thought about the women who would enter military service in the future and find an institution that protected them rather than exploiting them. She thought about the classified information that would no longer be sold to hostile foreign governments. She thought about the democracy that had survived an attempted coup because one person had refused to be silenced. "Senator," she replied, "I regret that it took so long for someone to speak up. I regret that good people died before the truth came out. But I don't regret choosing justice over silence." 3 weeks after the Senate hearing, Sergeant Lisa Chun stood at her brother's grave in Arlington National Cemetery, finally able to tell the truth about how Lieutenant Colonel David Chun had died. The military had posthumously awarded him the Medal of Honor for his sacrifice in exposing the conspiracy, and his grave was now marked with the honor he deserved. "David," she whispered, placing fresh flowers on the headstone, "they said no one would ever know what you died for. They were wrong." Chun had been promoted to captain and assigned to the new Military Ethics Oversight Division, where her experience with corruption investigations would help prevent future conspiracies. Her torture at the hands of the conspiracy had left physical scars, but it had also given her a platform to advocate for reforms that would protect future whistleblowers. Standing beside her at the grave, Daisy reflected on how much had changed since that night in the warehouse. The two women had become symbols of resistance against military corruption, but more importantly, they had become friends bonded by shared sacrifice and common purpose. "Captain Chun," Daisy said formally, acknowledging her friend's promotion, "your brother would be proud of what you accomplished." Chun smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness Daisy had seen from her since the investigation began. "He would be proud of what we accomplished. None of this would have been possible without your courage in that warehouse." Master Sergeant Rodriguez had faced the most difficult choice of anyone involved in the conspiracy investigation. As the senior non-commissioned officer in the Special Operations Program, he had known about misconduct but had remained silent out of misplaced loyalty to the chain of command. His decision to help extract Daisy and Chun from the collapsed federal facility had redeemed him, but it couldn't erase years of complicity through inaction. "Ma'am," he approached Daisy after a ceremony honoring personnel who had exposed the conspiracy, "I want you to know that I'll carry the guilt of my silence for the rest of my career. I should have spoken up years ago." Daisy studied the weathered face of a man who had served honorably for 25 years before finding himself caught between loyalty and conscience. His final choice had been the right one, but she understood the weight he carried for not making it sooner. "Sergeant Rodriguez," she replied, "the most important thing isn't when you chose to do the right thing. The most important thing is that you did choose it when it mattered most." Rodriguez nodded, accepting the forgiveness she offered while understanding that self-forgiveness would be much harder to achieve. He had been reassigned to training duties where his experience could help educate future military leaders about the importance of moral courage in leadership positions. The trials of the conspiracy members became the most closely watched military legal proceedings in modern history. General Marcus Thorne, facing charges of sexual assault, abuse of power, and conspiracy to commit treason, had cooperated with investigators in exchange for a life sentence. Instead of execution, his testimony revealed the full scope of how the conspiracy had operated, using sexual harassment and abuse as leverage to ensure silence about financial fraud and espionage activities. Women who reported misconduct were either silenced through intimidation or eliminated through accidents that investigators had previously been unable to prove were murders. "The system protected us because we were useful," Thorne testified. His once commanding presence reduced to that of a broken man facing the consequences of decades of corruption. "As long as we delivered intelligence and contracts to the right people, our personal conduct was overlooked." But the most damaging testimony came when he revealed the names of Pentagon officials who had knowingly protected the conspiracy in exchange for campaign contributions and lucrative post-retirement consulting contracts. The revelation triggered a secondary investigation that reached into the highest levels of civilian military oversight. Colonel James Mitchell, who had tried to intimidate Daisy into silence, received a 20-year sentence for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. His attempt to force her to sign away her rights had been recorded by federal surveillance, providing irrefutable evidence of his participation in the cover-up. Deputy Secretary of Defense William Harrison, whose attempt to interfere with the FBI investigation had been witnessed by multiple federal agents, was sentenced to 15 years for obstruction of justice and abuse of power. His conviction sent a clear message that civilian officials who protected military corruption would face the same consequences as the officers they enabled. The most classified aspects of the trials involved the foreign intelligence services that had recruited and operated the military conspiracy. Russian, Chinese, and Iranian intelligence agencies had spent years cultivating military officers who could provide classified information and influence defense procurement decisions. The financial trails revealed payments totaling over $500 million with classified military technology and operational plans sold to hostile governments for over a decade. The damage to national security was so extensive that several ongoing operations had to be completely restructured to account for compromised intelligence. But the most serious revelation was that foreign intelligence services had been planning to activate their military assets for a coordinated attack on American democratic institutions if the conspiracy was exposed. The attempted assault on Fort Braxton and the federal facility had been just the beginning of a plan that included assassinations of congressional leaders and the declaration of martial law by compromised military commanders. This wasn't just corruption, testified CIA Director Sarah Patterson during a closed session of the Senate Intelligence Committee. This was a comprehensive attack on American democracy using our own military leaders as weapons against the Constitution they had sworn to defend. The revelation that American military officers had been prepared to participate in the overthrow of the American government sent shockwaves through the defense establishment and led to the most extensive security review in military history. 6 months after the Senate hearing, Daisy Perry found herself in an unusual position. Her military career was effectively over. The controversy surrounding her whistleblowing had made it impossible for her to serve in operational units, and she had received too much media attention to work in classified positions. But her experience had also made her uniquely qualified for a new role that hadn't existed before the conspiracy was exposed. The Department of Defense created the position of Special Advisor for Military Ethics and Whistleblower Protection, with a mandate to prevent future corruption and protect service members who reported misconduct. Private Perry, Secretary of Defense Robert Matthews said during her appointment ceremony, "Your courage in exposing this conspiracy has saved American democracy from one of the most serious threats it has ever faced. We need your experience to ensure that such a threat never emerges again." The position gave Daisy the authority to investigate misconduct reports, protect whistleblowers from retaliation, and recommend reforms to military culture and procedures. It was, in many ways, the mission she had always been meant to serve protecting. The institution she loved from the corruption that threatened to destroy it from within. Her first major case involved investigating similar patterns of misconduct at other military installations, using the lessons learned from the Fort Braxton conspiracy to identify and eliminate corruption before it could metastasize into treason. The most important outcome of the conspiracy investigation wasn't the trials or the prison sentences, it was the fundamental change in military culture that followed the exposure of systematic corruption. New regulations required mandatory reporting of misconduct, established independent oversight of sexual harassment investigations, and created protection systems for whistleblowers. But the most significant change was attitudinal. The conspiracy had demonstrated that silence in the face of misconduct wasn't loyalty. It was complicity in activities that threatened national security and the lives of fellow service members. "The greatest honor we can show our fallen comrades," Daisy said during the speech at the Military Ethics Training Center, "is ensuring that their sacrifice leads to lasting change." We owe it to them, to ourselves, and to future generations of military personnel to maintain the highest standards of integrity and accountability. The speech was delivered to a class of new military officers who would serve in an institution transformed by the courage of people who had refused to stay silent when silence would have been easier and safer, despite the success of the investigation and the reforms it had triggered. Daisy understood that the threat of corruption and foreign influence was ongoing. Intelligence reports continued to identify attempts by hostile governments to recruit American military personnel, and the networks exposed by the conspiracy had been replaced by new, more sophisticated operations. "This isn't a problem we solve once and forget about," she explained to a congressional oversight committee. "This is an ongoing battle that requires constant vigilance and the courage to speak truth to power when we encounter misconduct." Her new position required her to brief senior military and civilian leaders on emerging threats, investigate reports of misconduct that might indicate foreign influence, and maintain the reforms that had been implemented in the wake of the conspiracy. But, perhaps most importantly, she served as a visible reminder that the military would protect those who chose integrity over complicity, courage over silence. The personal cost of her choices had been enormous. Daisy's military career in its traditional form was over. Her life would always be shadowed by security concerns, and she would forever be associated with one of the most traumatic episodes in military history. But sitting in her office overlooking the Pentagon, reading reports from military personnel who no longer had to suffer in silence because they knew this system would protect them, she felt a satisfaction that no combat medal or promotion could have provided. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Captain Lisa Chun entered with a stack of files, new cases that required investigation, reports of misconduct that might indicate broader patterns of corruption. "More work?" Daisy asked with a smile. "More opportunities to make a difference," Chun replied. 3 sexual harassment cases, 2 financial irregularities that might indicate foreign influence, and 1 report of classified information being mishandled. As they began reviewing the cases, Daisy reflected on how different their work was from the special operations missions she had once dreamed of completing. But this work protecting the institution they loved from the corruption that threatened to destroy it was perhaps the most important mission either of them would ever serve. 1 year after the warehouse confrontation that had started everything, Daisy received an unexpected visitor at the Pentagon. General Marcus Thorne, now serving a life sentence in federal prison, had requested a meeting through his attorneys. The meeting took place in a secure conference room at the military prison, with federal marshals providing security and recording equipment documenting every word. Thorne looked older and frailer than the commanding figure who had tried to assault her in Warehouse 7. His prison uniform a stark contrast to the decorated dress uniform he had once worn with such pride. "Private Perry," he began, his voice hoarse and defeated. "I wanted to apologize for what I tried to do to you, and to thank you for stopping me before I could destroy more lives." The apology was unexpected, and Daisy sensed genuine. Prison had apparently given Thorne time to confront the reality of his actions and their consequences. "General," she replied carefully, "I appreciate your apology. But the person you really need to apologize to is every woman whose career you destroyed, every family member of the people who died, protecting classified information from foreign enemies, every service member whose trust you betrayed." Thorne nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I know. I've written letters to all of them, though I don't expect forgiveness. I wanted you to know that in exposing the conspiracy, you didn't just save American national security, you saved my soul. Prison gave me the chance to remember who I was supposed to be, before I became something monstrous." The meeting lasted only 20 minutes, but it provided closure to a confrontation that had changed both their lives forever. As she left the prison, Daisy reflected on the strange turns that life could take, how a moment of refusing to be victimized had led to exposing treason, how standing up to a corrupt general had saved American democracy, how choosing courage over compliance had transformed her from soldier to guardian of military integrity. 5 years after the warehouse confrontation, Daisy stood before a graduating class of military officers who had been trained in an institution transformed by the exposure of the conspiracy. These young men and women would serve in a military where reporting misconduct was seen as a duty rather than a betrayal, where sexual harassment was investigated rigorously rather than covered up, where loyalty meant loyalty to the Constitution rather than blind obedience to corrupt authority. "You are the guardians of American democracy," she told the graduates. "That guardianship requires more than physical courage in combat. It requires moral courage in peacetime. It requires the willingness to speak up when you see wrongdoing, to protect those who cannot protect themselves, to remember that your oath is to the Constitution, not to individuals who might betray that Constitution." Among the graduates was a young lieutenant whose eyes reminded Daisy of her own determination 15 years earlier. After the ceremony, the lieutenant approached with the kind of question that indicated she understood the true meaning of military service. "Ma'am," the lieutenant said, "how do we know when we have the moral authority to disobey orders or challenge authority?" Daisy smiled, recognizing in the question the same struggles she had faced throughout her career. "Lieutenant, you have the moral authority and the moral obligation to challenge authority whenever that authority violates the Constitution you swore to defend. The difficult part isn't knowing when you have the right to act, it's finding the courage to act when the moment comes." As the young officer walked away, Daisy felt a sense of completion. The institution she had fought to reform was now producing leaders who understood that true military discipline required the courage to resist corruption rather than enabling it. 10 years after the warehouse confrontation that had changed her life, Daisy Perry retired from government service with the knowledge that she had participated in one of the most important reforms in military history. The military ethics and whistleblower protection program she had built was now a permanent part of military culture, staffed by officers who understood that protecting the institution required constant vigilance against those who would corrupt it. Her retirement ceremony was attended by hundreds of military personnel whose careers had been saved by the reforms she had implemented, including many women who no longer had to choose between military service and personal safety. Captain Lisa Chun, now a colonel serving as Director of Military Intelligence Oversight, delivered the keynote address. 10 years ago, a private named Daisy Perry faced a choice that would define not just her own future, but the future of American military service. She could have stayed silent, accepted that sexual harassment and corruption were simply part of military culture, and completed her training without making waves. Instead, she chose courage. She chose to record evidence of misconduct. She chose to fight back when a general tried to assault her. She chose to expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of military command. And because of those choices, every person wearing this uniform today serves in an institution worthy of the oath we have taken. As the ceremony concluded, Daisy reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a midnight summons to an abandoned warehouse. The compact woman with gentle eyes who had refused to be cornered by a corrupt general had become a symbol of integrity in military service and a guardian of democratic institutions. But perhaps most importantly, she had proven that individuals with moral courage could change systems that seemed unchangeable, that truth could triumph over corruption, and that justice was possible even when powerful people tried to prevent it. Standing in the same warehouse where it had all begun, now converted into the Daisy Perry Center for Military Ethics, she read the plaque that had been installed to commemorate the night that changed everything. On this site, Private Daisy Perry refused to accept that sexual harassment and abuse of power were acceptable in military service. Her courage in recording evidence of misconduct and defending herself against Assault led to the exposure of the largest military corruption conspiracy in modern American history. This center is dedicated to ensuring that future military leaders have the moral courage to choose integrity over complicity, truth over silence, and justice over self-preservation. The transformation was complete. What had been a sight of attempted assault and corruption had become a symbol of redemption and reform. The institution she loved had been saved from the cancer that threatened to destroy it. From within. As she prepared to leave the center for the final time as an active government employee, Daisy's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Thank you for showing us that one person can make a difference." A grateful nation, she smiled, understanding that her real legacy wasn't the awards or recognition she had received, but the knowledge that future generations of military personnel would serve in an institution that protected rather than exploited them. The war for justice that had begun in Warehouse 7 was won, but the vigilance required to maintain that victory would continue forever. And somewhere in military installations around the world, new guardians were preparing to take up that responsibility, inspired by the example of a woman who had refused to be silent when silence would have been complicity. The story of Daisy Perry was complete, but the story of military integrity that she had helped to restore would continue as long as there were people willing to choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and justice over personal safety. And in that continuation, her greatest victory was assured. She had not just exposed corruption. She had inspired a generation of military leaders to prevent it from ever taking root again. The story of Daisy Perry reminds us that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they choose courage over compliance, truth over silence, and integrity over self-preservation. Her journey from sexual assault victim to military reformer demonstrates that individual actions can have consequences far beyond what we can imagine in the moment we make our choices. If this story has moved you, inspired you, or simply entertained you during your commute or workout, I'd be incredibly grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video and share it with others who appreciate powerful storytelling. Creating these novel-length narratives requires enormous research, writing, and production effort, but it's worth it when stories like Daisy's can remind us of the better angels of human nature. Most importantly, please subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest stories. I'm constantly working on new narratives that explore the complexities of human courage, the price of integrity, and the power of individuals to change the world around them. Your support means everything to me and allows me to continue bringing you these detailed, immersive stories that transport you to different worlds and introduce you to characters who embody the best of human potential. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your engagement. And I'll see you in the next story. Until then, remember Daisy Perry's example: sometimes the most important battle you'll ever fight is the one where you refuse to be silent when silence would be complicity. Stay strong, stay courageous, and never underestimate the power of one person to change everything. Subscribe now, and let's continue exploring these incredible stories of human courage together.